Thank you for joining us for the Risk Management, Avoiding Noncompliance and SIF Subgrantee webinar. My name is Rose Armour, and I'm the Training Manager for the Social Innovation Fund. This webinar was developed for grantees looking at managing risk for subgrantees and subrecipients, and so thank you all for joining. Before we start, I would like to cover some basic housekeeping. Everyone's line has been muted upon entry, but to ensure that we don't get any unexpected noises, we would like to ask everyone to mute their own lines as well. We are recording this webinar. After the webinar, we will email all the participants the link to the recording and the slide deck. There will be time throughout the webinar for Q&A, and if you have questions, type them into the chat feature on the right-hand side of your screen. And please make sure to send all your questions to all participants or chat to everyone. Finally, if you have to step away from your phone, please do not place your phone line on mute, as your phone service hold music could potentially interrupt the presentation. So today I'm joined by Chris Tecci, who is one of our subject matter experts on financial grants management for the SIF Technical Assistance Contract. She is a wealth of knowledge and has been very valuable as we have developed the risk assessment tool for this webinar. We are also joined by Laura D'Alessandro, the Program Officer for Local Initiative Support Corporation. Laura works on both the compliance and program implementation for the Financial Opportunity Center program at LISC, and she has a strong background in managing multi-location federal grants. She is currently working on 2 of LISC's 3 SIF grants. So Laura and the entire LISC team have consistently worked with SIF to share their insights and their lessons learned, and have shared numerous resources, all of which are available on the SIF Knowledge Network. So thank you to Chris and Laura for helping us with this webinar, and thank you to all of the participants for joining us. And now I'll turn it over to Chris, who can start the presentation.
Thank you, Rose. Before we get started, I'd like to hear from everybody to see where you are in the subgrantee onboarding process. Jenny is going to open a poll in just a minute, so if you could take a few minutes and answer the poll questions on the right side of your screen, we'd appreciate it. I'm going to let it go for another 20 or so seconds, and just let everybody know as a reminder that the Risk Management Toolkit was sent out with a reminder for this webinar, and after we complete the poll, Jenny will put it up in the chat bar if you do not have it in front of you. Okay, the poll has ended, and they are calculating where everybody's at. So it looks like there's a large mix. If you look in the chat bar of your screen, you'll see that about 25% are in the pre-awarding stage. Just a couple people are in contracting. The majority, about half the folks, are in the monitoring phase, and about 25% of the folks did not respond, and that could represent the support staff and us on the line. So it looks like we have a mix. However, a lot are in monitoring. So we'll look to get the information that everybody needs, focusing mainly on a little bit of everything, but primarily on monitoring. So Jenny, if you could put the next slide up. So as a Social Innovation Fund or SIF grantee, there's inherent risk in managing federal grants. As you know, you and your subgrantees have agreed to comply with all applicable federal requirements. For the purpose of the toolkit, risk is defined as a likelihood that a SIF subgrantee could become non-compliant with any statutory and regulatory requirements during the grant life cycle. Non-compliance by either a SIF grantee or subgrantee can jeopardize future funding. Each organization's risk management is unique, and we recommend that you work closely with the appropriate individuals within or outside your organization to help consider what your additional risk factors may be and ways to mitigate them. It's critical that your SIF organizational leadership team work with you and determine the organization's risk tolerance. That is, the amount of risk that they're willing to take which your organization feels comfortable with. Both financial and reputational risks are often a result of noncompliance. So what resources is each organization willing to dedicate to mitigate them? This answer is going to differ depending on each grantee. Next slide, please. You will find the figure on the slide on page 2 of the toolkit. This figure divides risk into 3 separate categories: high, medium, and low. The slide provides general information on the differences at each level, and you can see that the differences as part of the tool will shift depending on the resources put together. It is important to note that a subgrantee's risk level may change at any time, depending on a variety of factors. Laura's going to touch upon some of this in real-life examples as she monitors grants. It's critical to understand the possible points of risk that will allow programs to be flexible and create subgrantee support that increase grant compliance and reduce or mitigate your risk for your portfolio. So let's start with some common risks associated in Stage 1 or pre-award. Next slide, please. So since only about a quarter, I will go through this relatively quickly. But in the stage of pre-award, which is located on pages 2 and 3 of the toolkit, we'll provide you with an overview of common risks during the pre-award phase. One factor during the pre-award phase is your program's risk assessment and the capacity of your subgrantees to manage federal funds. Another factor is the size of each subgrant. The figures on the slide show how the size of the subgrant can increase the risk of noncompliance. For example, an organization with total grants of $2 million, choosing 20 different subgrantees with grants of $100,000 would likely be a higher risk than choosing 10 grants of $200,000. If all grantees had similar experience, the portfolio with 20 grantees has a larger chance to make a mistake. Another example would be $2 million in grants, having 4 grants of $500,000, granting those funds to a group of local nonprofits without experience with federal funds. The large nonprofits have experience where the local nonprofits may not have experience. Note again, I'm making some generalities to show planning examples at the pre-award stage. Obviously, there's new grantees that will be very compliant, as well as established grantees that may have an issue of noncompliance. Again, it's just information that helps you as you consider making your funding decisions. Next slide, please. On pages 3 and 4 of the toolkit, we provide an overview of key considerations for mitigating risk at the pre-award stage. It's important to consider the risk assessment in this early stage as you create the RFP. Be sure to ask organizational capacity questions that provide insight on experience with federal funds, similar grants, similar sizes, what the organization size is compared to the total funds. It's also helpful to ensure that you select a diverse panel of reviewers with a variety of experience and expertise. Once SIF grant awards are made, you'll end up working collaboratively with your program and your program officer to determine the number of grants, the location, the size, and type of subgrantees that will help you successfully implement your SIF program. Make sure that you're considering the staff and organizational capacity, the ability to raise the matching funds, what size portfolio works with the staffing that you've selected, and the comfort of experience with federal funds. So now I'm going to hand it over to Laura, our next speaker, to talk about some examples in this pre-award phase. Laura?
Great, thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about LISC's experience with risk assessment, specifically in pre-award. But we think about risk all throughout our grant lifecycle, and this is something that we have been refining since we got our first award in 2010, and we've discovered along the way, and we have built out with our grants team, our grants and contracts management. So we think about, in the beginning, our pre-award, so as we're doing an RFP and we're putting out the request, and then when in that period between post-award and pre-grant, because there's a period before the grant actually starts, and then again at the beginning of the grant. And so the way we think about risk at pre-award, so as we're doing that RFP, is really by gathering a lot of documents like the audit and checking the Federal Audit Clearinghouse. We will also ask groups to assess their own internal capacity to manage federal funds and ask them to discuss the staffing that they have on hand, and that helps us to understand, you know, what their accounting department might look like, what their compliance department might look like. Once we've decided that they're going to get an award, we still haven't officially given them the award, but we have this period of the post going through the RFP and the start before the actual grant period. And this is where we really try and dive into the policies and procedures of our groups, specifically accounting and procurement. We look at HR policies and procedures as well. And then we also take a look at financial ratios from their audit. So we're trying to get a sense of how much cash on hand they have and their overall viability as an organization. And this period allows us to give some feedback on policies and procedures, and then also to address any issues that we might see in the financials. This is where we start training. So this is where we begin just coming in and providing technical assistance. And then once we give the award, I'd love to say that, you know, we are able to back off because we've done all of this preparation. What we actually do is we consider everybody high risk for 3 months. And for us, that means that all of our subgrantees submit full backup documentation for the first 3 months of the award. This doesn't matter if they are a huge organization, which we have an organization that we subgrant to that's actually bigger than we are, and then or even small groups. And because we find that the proof is really in the pudding. Until we see it, we don't know what folks are actually doing. And then at the end of the 3 months, we reassess. And we decide if the group will stay in that high-risk designation or if they're going to switch over to low risk. And what we find is by doing that 3 months of sort of intensive work with the groups, we're actually able to provide really targeted TA because we're seeing everything. We're seeing them, their selection process for consultants. We're seeing their timesheets. And so this really gives us a really nice place to begin, although it is intensive, and it does have a lot of, I think our subgrantees might argue that it takes a lot of work, but we think that it pays off over the long run of the overall award. And that's what I'm going to say for right now, and then I'll come back in and talk about how we do our risk assessment throughout the award at later stages.
Great, thank you, Laura. So moving on to the next stage is contracting. It's a quick yet critical stage in the process, as Laura mentioned, giving the awards, which is the stage in terms of contracting. So pages 4 and 5 of the toolkit provide a brief overview of common risks during the contracting stage of the grant lifecycle. Contracting is the core of relaying all of the SIF grant requirements to the subgrantees. Key areas around risk when contracting include ensuring subrecipients or subgrantees are aware of all federal requirements, that they're clear, especially around those relating to national service criminal history checks. Subgrantees must be clear and provided information on the SIF terms and conditions, and you want to ensure that the contract is executed by an authorized individual. This is a stage also referred, as Laura mentioned, in terms of the onboarding. So looking at information dissemination, training and technical assistance needs to set your grantee up for success. A lot of folks sign documents and agree to a lot of things that they might not be aware of. So think of your onboarding and your information that you want to relay to your subgrantees in this phase. Next slide, please. The toolkit provides a list of important considerations for managing risk during this contracting piece. The list includes links to sample documents that may be really helpful for grantees as they develop new forms and tools to support them in managing the grant. Considerations include ensuring you have conducted a risk assessment of all your prospective grantees, creating and sharing a monitoring plan to support subgrantees, especially those that are high risk and likely to be new to SIF or managing federal funds. We will go into more depth on monitoring in an upcoming webinar. However, sharing the monitoring tool will allow your subgrantees to know the key issues of grant compliance. Another consideration is developing a comprehensive training and technical assistance plan, providing sample tools and forms for your subgrantees, such as invoicing forms, national service criminal history checklists, and various monitoring forms, providing the subgrantees with a clear set of policies and procedures in terms of outlining and tracking how to report on match and or create their monthly invoices or complete their financial reports, and creating an internal structure for ongoing oversight. So whether that is setting up regular in-person meetings, setting up webinars for them, having regular check-ins or meetings with them. Subgrantees are partners in executing on the SIF grant, so you want to make sure that you equip them as their success is your success. Next slide. So most of you were in the monitoring stage. So in terms of looking at the tool, once your subgrantees have been selected, your focus will shift to monitoring. On pages 5 and 6 of the tool, there's a detailed overview of the essentials in preparing for this stage. In preparing for this stage, you are now required to conduct a subgrantee risk assessment and to comply with the uniform guidance. Again, in previous stage, it was recommended. At this point, it is now required. The toolkit provides several links to this tool in the Knowledge Network that will help you with this process. So after you complete your risk assessment and determine how you're going to baseline your subgrantee's risk level, you can identify the level of monitoring needed. As Laura mentioned, they have the specific 3-month phase where people are high risk, and then they adjust their risk levels. Know that, again, at any point in time on the grant that the risk levels could shift. So the chart on the slide can also be found on page 5 of the toolkit that provides a summary of guidelines. Again, in the example, high-risk subgrantees may require you to create a detailed oversight plan to confirm their compliance. It might be a weekly conference call, required documentation, documented completion of the national criminal history checks, and be the first on the list to request site visits, where your lower-risk subgrantees might have their site visits scheduled at the end of the year and or may have a remote desk audit or a monthly call. Again, there's no specific requirement in terms of how you monitor your grants, but you definitely want to use a risk rating to adjust the support and interactive needed for your subgrantees. Next slide. So on page 5 of the toolkit, there's a list of general outputs of monitoring. Remember, risk management is an ongoing process and part of every successful subgrantee relationship. Things are not static and will likely change throughout the process. Although it's impossible to eliminate all risk inherent in managing a federal grant, the toolkit will provide you with specific ways that SIF Classic grantees can mitigate the risk and support your subgrantees with successful implementation. I'm now going to pass it back to Laura, who's going to share a little bit more about her examples and experience. Laura?
Sure.
Laura, before you get started, we had a question from your last discussion. What documents exactly are you asking for during the first 3 months in the high-risk phase, besides timesheets and a detailed general ledger?
So we're actually asking for the full backup documentation for every single charge on our financial reports. So it's the timesheets, it's the general ledger, it's the payroll register. If they bought supplies, we want to see the receipt for it. And we actually go through everything, and we do the really basic piece, which is we just add it all up and make sure it adds up. And we oftentimes find mistakes there. And then we also take a look at what this allows us to do is actually take a look at the systems that are in place, the procedures. You oftentimes get a policy book that tells you what the policies are of an organization, but it's hard to know if they're really implementing those. And so by getting all of this backup documentation, we actually get to see the procedures behind it. We get to see if they have purchase orders, if things are approved, if timesheets are always signed off on. And it gives us a sense of internal control of an organization. And so it really, we kind of get deep into their kitchen for a little bit as we're looking closely at that backup. So we ask for everything, and we spend just a lot of time doing really basic review. And we also do this thing that I like to call the think test, is that, you know, if anything seems weird, we start asking more questions. So if the benefits rate seems high for one person or doesn't seem in line with what we expect, we'll ask more questions. We'll go back to their manuals and make sure that things make sense when we look at what they say their policies are with what we're seeing. Some things that we've seen are that sometimes they're paying for cell phones, but that's not a policy that they have. Or, you know, we start catching some smaller things that we go back to our groups and say, listen, we need things to be applied consistently. We need to see the policies in place. You know, it really gives us that opportunity. Were there any other questions?
Nope, that was the only one at this time, so thank you very much.
Okay, absolutely. So in an ongoing way, we're monitoring our groups throughout the whole award period. We have a couple of points where we are able to do some additional risk assessment. So for all of our groups, we do an annual reassessment. So as we're closing out one of our years and we're starting a new one, we ask all of our groups to submit a reassessment package where they talk about how they did in the previous year and their plans for the following year. And we use that as a moment in time to really dig deep into the SAM.gov check, into their policies and procedures. Again, we have them resubmit so that we can review in case there have been updates. And then we take that as a moment for ourselves to really step back and think about groups. Sometimes we get caught up in the day-to-day, and that gives us a chance to say, listen, this group is doing really well. We'd like them to present to other groups, or, you know what, we're seeing more and more problems. We need to go and talk to this group before it gets any worse. So that happens for everybody right around the same time. We do also monitoring site visits, and those happen usually after about 6 months to 12 months. That's the last half of a year of for every year we do it in the last 6 months of the award typically. And that allows us just to ask more questions and get to know the systems a little bit better. This is something that we've learned over time that we need to keep asking. Our first SIF grant, we did similar type of approach where we did full backup and we got a lot of information, and we did some webinars on timesheets. And then we realized that our groups, some of our groups, and actually a significant percentage, were doing timesheets, but when we did the math to see if they were billing us at the level of the timesheet, so the timesheet would say this person is working 33% of their time, and we would actually do the math and see what they were really billing us, we found that there was a discrepancy. And that was a big learning for us, because we thought, if you look at the timesheet, everything looks good, then everything should be just fine on the actual expense, and that actually is not the case. And so we instituted a periodic timesheet review, and this is something that we typically don't plan. We sort of, and the reason we don't plan is we like it to be a bit of a surprise for our groups. And we basically for 1 month say, please send me the full backup for 1 or 2 staff. And we ask for the payroll register, we ask for the amount billed, we ask for the GL, the general ledger, and the timesheet. And we do the math. We just go through and say, this is what we see from the timesheet. Is that reflected in what is being billed? And that helps us to really hone in on something that we have found to be a really big hotspot. Another thing that we have found as a hotspot for us that needs periodic review is the audits. Making sure the audits are going to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse, making sure the audits don't have any findings, and if they do, that we are doing some follow-up to make sure that findings are not repeated. And so this is something that we are tracking very regularly. And then another spot that we have hot spots on is that, and I'm just sort of listing off a few of them, is that we also will redo our SAM.gov checks on our groups at least every year. Sometimes our grants and contracts team does it even more often, so they might do it quarterly. And what we see is not that people are not registered, although every once in a while somebody forgets to renew and we give them the reminder. We occasionally see folks that are delinquent on federal debt, and there's usually a great explanation, but we don't move forward until that is resolved. Meaning if we're in the process of giving them additional funding for another year, we pause until that's dealt with. We don't make payments. We make sure that the federal debt issue is dealt with. And I'm actually a little bit surprised that we've seen this a few times now, and the amounts of the federal debt tend to be really small. It's usually a payroll issue, but it's something that will pop up, and so it's something that we keep our eye on, and our grants and contracts team keeps an eye on, and we in the program side also keep an eye on. And then the last hotspot that we see is sometimes where program and compliance meet. So specifically is if there are times where we are handing out bus passes to our participants. This tends to be an area where program staff are managing the bus passes. And so we see that there can be breakdowns there. There could be an issue where the compliance team thinks that everything's good because they've got the accounting behind the purchase of all the bus passes, but the actual bus passes aren't being tracked as they're being given out. And so that's another thing that we try and provide a lot of technical assistance on for anybody who we know is doing incentives or other types of things that would be non-cash items that go over to our participants. And then one of the last hotspots that we see is around procurement. Procurement policies, we make sure they're in place, but we oftentimes find that groups just don't follow the procurement policies. And so as part of our reporting for their financial reports, we ask that groups, if they're adding new consultants, that they include the procurement package and the contract with those consultants. And so it's something that we keep hitting home, and I think it's because groups don't do it as regularly. They're not hiring consultants every month. They might hire a consultant once a year. That's an area that we have to really drive the message home and follow up on and continue to push as something that is important and that has procedures that have to be followed in their internal procedures specifically. So those are a few of the hot spots. We've seen all sorts of things, and the key for us is really to find things early, and so that we can get them fixed. And the best thing that can ever happen to us is that when we have a group that is really willing to engage and asks us beforehand and says, listen, we're going to be redoing our timesheet system, we're going to an online system, do you mind taking a look? or we want to update our policies and procedures, will you take a look before it goes to the board? And those are my favorite groups to work with, because then we can really, we can identify things ahead of time and save everybody a lot of extra work and extra back and forth. And so we try and build out that relationship wherever we can, knowing that it's usually the accounting team or the compliance team that we have to build a relationship with. So we try and make sure that we focus on that, and not just with the program staff. So those are some of the things that we do. I'm happy to answer any questions about other risk assessment or how we avoid noncompliance, but it's a constant thing that we are working on.
So we do have one question from Seb. Do we have to create a sub-monitoring plan for each sub on an individual basis, or is one comprehensive template sufficient? Should these plans be approved by the SIF program officer? And I can answer that last question. The answer to the last question is no. But Chris or Laura, do you want to answer the first part of the question?
So I guess I'll start and have Laura kind of chime in what she does. I think that creating a rubric like what you do for high, medium, and low-risk grantees is your kind of first plan. I think that your plan might morph into some specificity based on what the actual needs of the grantees are. As Laura mentioned, once you see a deficiency or an area of need in your subgrantees, you want to follow that to make sure that you're providing the necessary support and assistance so that they know how to be compliant with their actions. So it's kind of a general plan, but know that the assistance might be specific. Laura?
Yeah, and we have a monitoring checklist that we do that tells us if we have, it doesn't identify groups as high risk or low risk or medium risk, but it tells us if we have issues that we are finding that are major, so if their timesheets don't match, or if the group has not submitted their audit to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse. But we actually use our judgment when we are identifying risk. It's not for us, it's not if they do this, then they're high risk, because it's much more comprehensive than that. We can have a group that has really tight controls and they make a mistake and they fix it, and going forward we're not worried about it. Whereas we can have another group that looks great on paper, but when we see what they're actually doing, we are very worried. And so, we try and make sure that we have the latitude to be able to identify risk. And so, so we don't use a set matrix other than we have something that helps us to identify certain issues that are higher priority than perhaps other issues.
Great. Thanks. And we've had a couple of questions for people that are having challenges accessing or don't have an access to the Knowledge Network. We will send out the toolkit as a PDF attachment when we send out the information, the recording, and the slide deck. So that will be being emailed to you. If you do, but I just will plug, if you don't have access to the Knowledge Network, there's a lot of other resources on there besides the toolkit. So do let me know, and I will help you get access to that. Okay, so we have another question. When you find issues such as noncompliance with timesheets, as in your example, overcharging salaries, what are the typical corrective actions?
So for us, we do a couple of things. So as we're doing a sample, if we find one timesheet that's off, we expand our sample. So if we've pulled 2 or 3 people and looked at their timesheets and we notice that one of those is a problem, we expand. And we keep expanding until we figure out if the timesheet noncompliance is systemic or if it's just an error that happened one time. And so we keep expanding, we pull. So if we're looking at a specific month, we pull additional months. If we know that there has been a change in the timesheet system, we pull before that change and after that change to see if we can identify what the issue is. And so then what we do is we we correct whatever has happened. And so we use the timesheets as our source documents. The source documents sort of tell us what actually happened. And so we work with the groups to resolve the issue. So if they've overbilled us, then we expect that that will get worked out and that there will be either a change in cost, or they will reclassify those expenses that were not part of this grant originally off of the grant. And then, so we have to fix what happened before, and then we need something to get fixed going forward. So if it's something that's systemic, then we usually have a corrective action plan that goes into place, where we typically tell the group, you know, how quickly do you think you can get us some new timesheets? If, you know, a new timesheet format, if it's the actual timesheet itself that's not the actual time, like the Excel file, if they're using Excel that's not working, we ask them how quickly they can get us a new version, and then we review it before they implement it. If it's something else, we see all sorts of things like we have some groups that use a payroll system that hard codes percentages in, so they, no matter what, the person's going to be charged 15% to a grant. Then we talk to them about how they can do adjustments every month to fix any variation that they have, because 15% might be based on what they've budgeted but not on how the person actually spent time. And so we come up with some ways to fix things. With timesheet issues, it tends to be a big issue, so we usually will follow up within 3 weeks. If the group says we need more time, we follow up a little bit further on. But we always are going back to the group on timesheet issues. And typically, we are getting, for the next couple of months, if there has been a more of a systemic timesheet issue, we're getting the backup on salaries for the next couple of months until we're convinced that it's no longer an issue. If we ever find something that is systemic and large, meaning it's a big deal, they should have caught it, it indicates there's a larger internal control issue, we will often do a corrective action plan with expectations and timeframes of when things will get fixed. And if it's, you know, if we feel that it is big enough, we may even hire a consultant to assist them to fix the issue. We haven't had to do that. We did that in the first SIF with some of our groups that were unused to federal funding. In our 2015 award, we've only had to do, I would say, one corrective action plan where we really got in and had to fix things at a systemic level. And, you know, we tend to have to, that has to be a pretty in-depth process where we are talking to the group very regularly. We're getting things in writing, and we have a plan in place for them to get things up and running.
Great. And Laura, we have another question for you. When bringing on new subgrantees not used to the level of compliance, how do you deal with any pushback?
With a smile and this is part of this grant. So we try and be as nice as we can. We realize that this is, it can be onerous, but this is really the process for us, and we hold firm. One of the things that I think that is important for us is that we try and have somebody who has a programmatic relationship, and then somebody else who might be the compliance person who can come in and be the person who has to sort of say the things that nobody wants to hear. So, you know, I will be the bad guy and say, you know, listen, this is part of this grant, and this is, I take ownership of it. This is how I'm managing this grant to ensure compliance. And that way we have local LISC program officers. They don't have to mess with that. They don't have to be sort of that negative person. So we try and split that up so we can build relationships and not do any damage. But there have been a few times where we've had some pretty serious pushback. One of the things that we hear is, well, my other funders don't require this. And that is perhaps one of my least favorite responses. My other funders don't require that I have timesheets, or my other funders don't care if I'm doing procurement, and then they'll list off who that federal funder is. And, you know, my response typically is, well, I bet they do care, they just haven't caught you yet. So we did find this and we need to fix it. So we don't ever let things let things go. And in fact, while I'm on my site visits, so I will go out and do a lot of the site visits, when groups are pushing back on something, I usually, you know, if I'm doing a monitoring and they say to me, you know, it's going to be really hard for me to pull whatever I've asked for them to pull, I usually just say, you know, I'm happy to wait. I'm happy to, you know, I'll be here. I want to look at it. I need to look at it, because that oftentimes will signify that there's a larger problem. And so I always try and make sure that we are following up. So I don't know if I'm the most popular person on our staff with our subgrantees, unfortunately. I really like all of them, but you know, it is a harder place to be in, but it's really important that we're good stewards of the funds, and so we want to protect those SIF dollars, and one of the ways we do that is with our compliance and our risk assessment.
Great, thank you. So do we have any more questions? I don't see any more questions at this time, so I'll give people a minute or so to type up any remaining questions while you have Laura and Chris on the phone here. I know we also have some of the POs on the phone. I believe Kim and Marcy are both on the phone, if not, and Irvin maybe as well. Do you guys have any insight or anything that you would like to add to the information that Laura and Chris have shared while we wait for some more questions? I put the POs on the spot and then realized that they are muted like everybody else, so they can't speak. So Marcy just said that she didn't have really anything to add, and I'm not seeing any more questions. Laura and Chris, do you have any parting thoughts or any last tidbits of information that you'd like to share?
Chris, go ahead.
I guess I would say that one is, don't forget that the risk will always be shifting and changing, and you can take that into consideration as you're planning your schedule in terms of monitoring and support. And I think the other important thing is that in my work with a lot of the SIF subgrantees, a lot of them need a lot of support and assistance. So whereas some of the systematic issues in terms of asking for information might seem onerous, I think it's collective way to compliance in terms of what everybody wants. And in my 3 years working as a SIF coach, the grantees that really started and had a high learning curve in the first year or two are doing really well. So if you are new to SIF or new to federal funds management or oversight and subgrantees with federal funds, it certainly gets a whole lot easier as everybody becomes more knowledgeable. I think most people want to get it right, and they just need your help to know how to do that. Laura?
Yeah, I will echo that it is something that's ever changing. I will also say that when we started back in 2010, I think it was really hard. It was hard for us as we learned how to do the compliance management, and it was hard for our groups. 5 years later, now 6 years later, our groups that we struggled the most with are stronger than ever. They've actually been thankful that they went through the process. I don't think any of them would say it was easy. But we've heard mostly positive from having to be a part of the SIF cohort. And so, you know, taking the long view, it might feel hard in the short term, but it really prepares groups to go after additional federal funding if that makes sense for them. But beyond that, it just tightens up the internal controls of their organization, and that has benefits that are more than just compliance. Usually when we're tightening things up, and all of a sudden the groups will know what their true expenses are. You know, if they weren't using timesheets before, they didn't understand how the time was being spent. If they weren't using purchase orders, then maybe there were some issues with, you know, actually tracking expenses. You know, and we've really liked to be a part of that journey for the groups that we work with, and I think that is mostly reciprocated as much as it can be. So it is a long journey, and in the end, I think it's something to feel very positive about. And compliance, nobody loves compliance. Maybe some people do. I like it a lot, I guess. But, you know, that sort of tends to be the thing where people groan when you start doing it. But the feeling of going to a group after having a bad compliance site visit and having everything go perfectly is wonderful. It's something to celebrate, and we also try and do that. The last thing I'll say, because I think I'm talking too much, is that we love to bring our groups back in to talk to other groups. So if I see a policy that has been written very nicely, I usually will say to the group, hey, do you mind if I share this? Or if we've got somebody who has really figured out time and effort reporting and they've been through a journey on it, we'll send other grantees their way to talk to them, to say, how did you do this? And turning somebody from a recipient of technical assistance into somebody who is actually providing that technical assistance to somebody else is very, very powerful. And it makes everybody feel better about the process. So it's something that we have liked to do.
Great, thank you. So we do have a couple of more questions that have just come in. One, Bridget asked if CNCS is going to update their own monitoring tool, and we are in the final stages of updating the SIF monitoring tool, and that should be coming out, I would say, in a month or so. So I hope I'm not putting Irvin on the spot, but I believe that that's what he said last time. So I will clarify if it is going to be much longer than that in the email that we send out. And then finally, there's another question that maybe Chris you can answer, or Laura, you may know too. Are there formal classes or training available for these topics, other than like the webinars that we do? Are there, I know that there are some different companies that do that and some different organizations. Chris, do you have any insight? Or maybe people could ask their coaches too, their compliance coaches. But Chris, in the meantime, do you have any thoughts?
So I do, in terms of some of the most valuable kind of starting with the free local resources are nonprofits and nonprofit auditors in your area. Whether they're your auditor or not, there's a lot of kind of regional and large firms that are always looking to gather financial professionals. Most of them have website lists to sign up for additional training opportunities. Most are at low or very little cost, so that's a really good idea on some specific things. There are some local companies, kind of like with any training, that do federal grants management. A lot of it seems that it's more at the, if I am a federal agent and I'm doing grants, but one that comes to mind is, so if you Google federal grants management training, there'll be some, so those are the first two kind of resources that I think. Some publishing companies also have some books around some shared tools, but Rose, you mentioned the resource, the Knowledge Network, and I think that that is a huge resource in terms of information that's available there. But you can also ask the coaches, or we'll think of other things and put together a list. And please let us know if there's topics that you can't find anywhere that you're interested in. Rose is the key to training in SIF. So you've got the right person on the phone. Laura, did you think of any other additional resources?
No, I think doing, if you want, like oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Laura.
Oh, so we go to one, there's a training that we go to, we send our staff to, it's Management Concepts, and they do trainings around the country. And so when we've got somebody who's new, it's a good way to do a deep dive into regs. And there's a 3-day training that we like, and then there's an annual update that we like to do as well. There's another thing that we do, which is this federal funding webinars. A guy named Bob Lloyd does these webinars. and he has worked in federal compliance for, I don't know, like 30 years. He has a wealth of knowledge, and he helps to synthesize things, and so he will help to give an opinion on, you know, the regulations can be difficult to understand. He'll give an opinion on how to actually implement things, and so those are the two outside of SIF and outside of the Knowledge Network places that we go to get our compliance training.
Great, thank you so much. So as Chris said, I do the training for the Social Innovation Fund. So if you do have topics, my email is right there. Please don't, and my phone number, please don't hesitate to reach out to me if you find topics that are missing or trainings that you're looking for. We definitely have the process to do webinars like this and other things, so please let me know. Otherwise, I'd like to say thank you to Chris and Laura for presenting and being willing to take the time to do this. So thank you very much. The link is there for the risk management tool. As I said, we'll send it out as a PDF with the email that we're going to send out after the call. And I hope everyone enjoyed this and it was valuable. Thank you so much for joining us.